Mark Paul is an assistant professor and a member of the Climate Institute at Rutgers University. His research looks at the causes and effects of inequality and tries to work through some of the material remedies for inequality in the context of neoliberal capitalism. He's written a great deal on the climate crisis, focusing on economic pathways to crash decarbonization that also take into account the need for economic and environmental justice. His first book, The Ends of Freedom: Reclaiming America's Lost Promise of Economic Rights, was published in May of this year. This is now a moment where the existential threat of climate change is felt really intensely across the world. The remaining carbon budget for a 50% likelihood to limit global warming to 1.5, 1.7, and 2 degrees Celsius has dwindled in the years since the first COP in 1995. Assuming that our 2023 emissions levels continue at their current record-setting rate, and the Global Carbon Project has said that the total CO2 emissions in 2023 reached a disturbing 40.9 gigatons, we will burn through the budget for keeping global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2030. In 15 years, the carbon budget for 1.7 degrees Celsius will be gone too. In planetary terms, that's a split second. We need crash decarbonization now, because as Paul has pointed out, climate change is not a problem for future generations. It is a clear and present danger. So much time has been intentionally wasted, and due to that deadly strategy of delay, Paul says we now have 4 times the work to do to decarbonize the planet and dwindling time to do it in. A lot of the work within a capitalist economy is going to take the form of fighting for the appropriate level of investment. It makes all kinds of economic sense to phase out fossil fuels, and yet because the system has incubated and grown in the toxic stuff, we're stuck in it. Mark argues that if we wait just 1 decade more to really make the disruptive changes that are needed to decarbonize the fossil economy, we will, quote, drive up the costs associated with decarbonization by 40 to 70%, which amounts to well over $3 trillion in additional costs. One of the questions I had to ask him, though, was why is this such a hard sell? It often feels Sisyphean to try to communicate projected losses in a system that demands and yet resists change. So how do we frame it in a resonant sort of way? How do we dislodge the presentist attachment to the status quo? There are some answers in this interview and obviously some real questions remaining. Some of it centers on the question of growth, which Mark seems to feel is often the wrong question. Shrinking the economy, he suggests, needs to be taken seriously from the perspective of its social costs. I'm sympathetic to that because there is the political problem of ensuring that a mass mobilization for climate action doesn't leave people behind. So for that reason, we also spend time talking about the divisive ways that putting a price on carbon has been tried and some of the ways it could be done progressively. He says that a simple carbon tax is, as a form of a consumption tax, very regressive. It's going to unfairly hit low-income people harder when it should be a luxury tax that targets the wealthy specifically. On this point, I would quote Alexis Shotwell's book Against Purity, where she writes that the world must be shared, and with the non-human parts of this world maybe especially. She says that the world, in fact, quote, offers finite freedom, adequate abundance, modest meaning, and limited happiness. Partial, finite, adequate, modest, limited. And yet, she says, worth working on, with, and for. To quote something that you've co-authored, you write actually that during the past 2 centuries, fossil fuels have allowed for impressive industrialization and high levels of economic growth. However, the extraction of these fuel sources, of course, has devastated the environment that many communities depend on, and their combustion is responsible for the climate crisis. And so that leads us to this place where the climate crisis is demanding that we kind of end our entanglement with fossil fuels. And, of course, that's easier said than done. And it feels to me like what you're trying to offer is like a framework for thinking about it otherwise economically. And so, in that same piece, Decarbonizing the U.S. Economy, this big report that you co-authored, you say, contrary to orthodox theory, the U.S. economy is not operating at its maximum productive potential even. There's a great deal of unused capacity that a major public investment program could mobilize. So I just wondered if you could kind of help us reckon with the kind of, orthodox theory, as you describe it there, the policy orthodoxy that sort of, for whatever reason, presumes that the fossil fueled economy is necessarily running at maximum capacity. Like, why do we assume that, and how do we reimagine or reassess that assumption?
Just to back up for a moment, I do just want to reiterate, as you just highlighted, that the fossil fuel economy has led to tremendous improvements in human well-being, right? I mean, if we just look at where average life expectancy was pre-industrial revolution to where we are today, the gains are just astronomical. If we just look at, for instance, the tens of millions pulled out of poverty in China alone over the past few decades, the gains are just, and human well-being are just tremendous. And so, I think we need to, in particular, be deeply appreciative of the workers who have literally put their bodies on the line, time and time again to extract energy from our planet and to, feed our need to develop and grow as a global community. And, in particular, a lot of these fossil fuel jobs are dangerous jobs, coal mining being perhaps one of the most dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And what's fascinating is today, what we often see is that, thinking about fossil fuel jobs as good jobs. And one thing I just want to highlight before, getting into your question is that, it's important for us to ask why a particular job is a good job or a bad job. Fossil fuel jobs are not inherently good. The reason many fossil fuel jobs are quote unquote good jobs here in the United States isn't because they're lovely jobs. It isn't because they are, jobs that people inherently enjoy. It isn't because they are jobs that have no health risks. It's because workers organized, formed unions, and engaged in class struggle to ensure they reap some of the benefits from engaging in this extremely dirty extractive labor.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to highlight that because, I think often the fossil fuel sector is rightly vilified and blamed for the crisis we find ourselves in today. And I just want us to be sure that we separate that from the workers who are simply trying to provide themselves with livelihoods and also provide us with necessary energy. Mm-hmm. Now, that said, we've learned and known, certainly since my lifetime, that fossil fuels, generate more than energy. They generate pollution and they generate greenhouse gas emissions that directly leads to planetary warming and ocean acidification, which, we essentially today call climate change or the climate crisis. Now, thankfully, we have done a tremendous amount of research and development and essentially have the vast majority of the technology we need to decarbonize incredibly quickly. However, for political reasons, and I think this is really important, I think the main hurdle here is political hurdles. We have chosen, not to transition our economy, away from fossil fuels to this point. Now, one of the key arguments in terms of why that is people saying it would be too expensive. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the rationale is what is based on the point you brought up, which is, the economy is operating at full capacity. The economy is operating perfectly efficiently with every factory, every human gainfully employed, doing the best work they possibly could, with the exception of this one small pesky market failure that we call, greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we know this is just absolutely wild. I teach actually a graduate course on the economics and policy of the climate crisis. And my students asked me, they looked at the data and they said, okay, there's 7 million Americans unemployed today. Why is it that when I read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, everything says we're at, quote, full employment? 7 million Americans doesn't equate to full employment to me. This is literally a question I got from my students last week. And it's right. If you just take a step back and think about it as a human being, 7 million unemployed Americans is 7 million unemployed Americans. It's not full employment. It's not ensuring everybody who wants a job has one. But the basic economic assumption is that roughly 4 or 5% unemployment is quote unquote full employment, but that
Mm.
it's really you know a way to ensure that we maintain a substantial portion of the population out of a job, and in turn ensure that we maintain workers being too weak to properly bargain for excellent working conditions and excellent pay and things along those lines. And
Hmm.
so if it were true that we have a lot of resources idle in our economy, or not even that they're idle, that they're underproductive. So you could just imagine transitioning somebody from a worker at McDonald's flipping burgers to doing a more productive job in society, right?
Hmm.
And if that's the case, in fact, we could engage in government debt financed investment to help us transition away from fossil fuels. And we can reduce our emissions while simultaneously generating jobs and improving human well-being here in the United States. And that's actually where you see discussions around the Green New Deal and Inflation Reduction Act, for that matter, you know, um, engaging with, really changing the conversation from what I used to call, conversations around climate austerity, that we used to all have to tighten our belts and all sacrifice to help address climate change, to what we see today, where, actually we can all have electric vehicles and high quality public transit that is more enjoyable. And we can have more jobs and better jobs and safer jobs at the same time. So we really
Hmm.
can generate economic opportunity and a cleaner, healthier, more stable environment, and create this win-win situation. Now the hard part is
Yeah.
not everybody wins, right? Fossil capital doesn't win. You started asking about fossil capitalism,
Sure.
and that's precisely why I think we haven't acted. It's because fossil capital is powerful,
Hmm.
and they have a tremendous amount of sway in Washington, and they ensure that we do not, come out, you know, solar panels blazing and decarbonize as quickly as possible.
Hmm. This is the situation, and I definitely want to talk about the specific power of the fossil fuel industry and how you write about that power and how to kind of break it. But I wanted to pick up on this idea that I hear you kind of pointing to, that unemployment in some ways is like part of a neoliberal orthodoxy. And you write about neoliberalism extensively as a specific model of freedom within a free market fundamentalist kind of ideology. But this interesting claim in one essay where you talk about like how neoliberal policies promote competition, not solidarity, is interesting to me. You kind of suggest that like that implies a level of blindness, like that there's a neoliberal blindness that explains even potentially certain economists' disagreement with climate scientists about the goals of climate policy. But I just wanted to quote this section where you say, at one point, prominent economists argue that it would be optimal for the planet to warm more than 3.5 degrees Celsius on the basis of integrative assessment models that claim to balance the trade off between the cost of mitigating emissions with the benefit of a more stable climate. And this is the in part from the work of a Nobel laureate, William Nordhaus. It's staggering to me, but the idea that according to Nordhaus's calculations, putting a price on carbon to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is simply not feasible. Not feasible. So, like, what is the basis of that neoliberal blindness, and how can it mortgage the future to like a catastrophic level of warming? But it's part of the calculation. I wondered if you could kind of speak to that.
Yeah, this is something that I think people also have a really hard time reckoning with, which is the difference between the recommendations coming out of mainstream economics in terms of what we should do about climate change, and the difference between what's coming out of the scientific community. Now, taking a step back here for a moment, I want to acknowledge that we are a signatory of the Paris Climate Accords. And what the global community agreed upon there is to limit warming to, at most 2C, and do everything possible to limit it to 1.5C above pre industrial levels. Now, what that tells me is we already have our goal. What we need to do is do everything technically and economically feasible to meet that goal.
Hmm.
Despite that, what mainstream economists, people like Bill Nordhaus, who won a Nobel Prize for his work in economics, on the economics of climate change, say is not only that we should allow the planet to warm by 3.5 C by the end of this century, but indeed we should allow it to warm by 4 C by the middle of the next century. That is
What?
hell on
Yeah,
earth,
yeah,
according
it's
to the United Nations
unimaginable.
Secretary General. It is completely unimaginable.
Yeah, yeah.
Completely unimaginable. And, why is that? It's because he uses a model that does a terrible job at representing reality. It's not because that is what the best economics tells us. It is because that is what a toy model that he created spits out when you make a bunch of irrational assumptions that do a very poor job of reflecting the real world. That's all. That's it. And so if you ask me, let's throw that out. Let's stop paying attention to it. And let's take the Paris Climate Accords as our necessary starting point. And then think about, okay, how is it that we best reach this target? And that's the conversation we need to be having right now.
Hmm.
Now, that said, why do economists say this? I mean, it comes back to what I was mentioning earlier. Economists basically, even people like Bill Nordhaus, who, I don't know him personally, but I do believe he cares about climate change. And this is what's even crazier to think about. Here's a human who has dedicated their life to understanding the economics of climate change and appears to care about the issue. Yet they think we should allow the planet to warm to, 3.5 to 4 C. Which would, at that level of warming, most of Florida is literally gone. Most of the
Hmm.
entire country of Bangladesh is literally underwater.
Hmm.
Many, New York City would be, uninhabitable as it is today.
Right. Yeah.
So the degree of global change from that level of warming is just catastrophic. But it's not properly captured in their models, and so their models lead them to the wrong answers. And so I don't think they're helpful or useful models for us to rely on. I think the key question for me is what are, given the Paris Climate Accords, given, our targets, what are the appropriate, policy tools for us to engage in a program of crash decarbonization that simultaneously continues to improve living standards, in particular for environmental justice communities and for historically economically disadvantaged communities.
Hmm. I like this concept of crash decarbonization. Like, what does it mean to exist in a place of actual urgency in relationship to the climate emergency, to underline the now in acting on climate now, and not necessarily sort of abandon climate action, it feels like, to the market. There's a point at which you say the impending costs remain largely ignored due to their long-term projections and the blind faith put into markets to turn things around in time. Absolutely. Like, I just 100% agree. And I wanted to kind of pick up on this problematization of long-term projection of costs, as it seems like that's
Mhm.
like a central challenge. You say that waiting just one additional decade to act rather than starting now will drive up the costs associated with decarbonization by 40 to 70%, which amounts to well over $3 trillion in additional costs. So, like, I've seen so many projections like this, and yet the communication part of it seems to be part of what's really difficult. And I wondered if you could kind of relate any experiences you've had in kind of developing tools of communication, like that try to overcome the fact that speaking to long-term projections economically is kind of a hard sell.
I think in general, it's a failure of people's imagination. I think people are so when I say people, I don't think that this is everyday people. I think that this is largely, the economic wonk class that has a tremendous amount of sway in Washington. Whether this is, we're talking about the people at the Congressional Budget Office, um, who actually score climate legislation that gets put in front of Congress, or people within the large, powerful think tanks that have a tremendous amount of sway on the Hill in DC. I
Mm-hmm.
think people are so stuck in their neoliberal worldview that all we need to do is put a modest price on carbon and the market will fix everything. That is hard for them to, you know, think creatively about actually the exciting opportunities that this terrifying climate crisis presents us to reconfigure, our economy in ways that does a better job centering human well-being and human flourishing as opposed to short-term profit motives primarily for polluting industries. And I've seen this lack of imagination firsthand. I was at a dinner a few years ago with a very senior previous Obama official, and at that dinner, a senior campaigner for the Sunrise Movement, asked them, okay, let's just say we have $1 trillion to invest to address the climate crisis. Where do we start? And this very senior official from the Obama administration said, I don't know. It would just be wasteful. There's nowhere the government should be investing right now. And that to me is just insane and shows, I think, the true failures. Now, that said, I think that the Inflation Reduction Act has shown how far we've come in a very short period of time. Something like the IRA would not have happened without groups like Sunrise and, the huge debates around the Green New Deal. I mean, the IRA essentially is a mini Green New Deal. Is it enough? Absolutely not. The way I think about this is a down payment on addressing our needs to fight the climate crisis. But it is very true that if you talk to the want class, that what passed in the IRA is absolutely not what economists would have recommended. People like Jason Furman, who was President Obama's chief economist in the Council of Economic Advisors, has fairly openly, called a lot of that spending wasteful. I mean, I think he's dead wrong. And I think there's very strong evidence to highlight why he's dead wrong. How, the evidence in particular is important here to think about the government's role in not only fixing markets, fixing market failures, but in actually creating and directing markets to serve social ends. And that's exactly what something like the Inflation Reduction Act tries to do. Now, keep in mind, the IRA was a compromise bill. It's, far less than what President Biden initially proposed in Build Back Better. And President Biden, of course, was proposing far less than more courageous climate champions that were running for the Oval Office, people like Jay Inslee, Senator Bernie Sanders, and others. And so things have been continuously whittled down to less than what we need. Yet here we are.
Here we are, right? And I think it's important to remember that, as the authors of a recent book called The End of This World, Climate Justice in So-Called Canada put it, there's not a point after which sort of hope is lost. This is where I really appreciate your emphasis on the kind of key victories of the Sunrise Movement. What I wanted to ask, though, is for people that need a little bit of inspiration to be reminded of the fact that, like, there is, of course, like a moment here where the Inflation Reduction Act is a piece of legislation that literally requires the government to issue new oil and gas leases. And that feels like an enormous failure, that there is not a point after which hope is lost. Like, if you could give people a sense of what the most accessible way that they can kind of learn about maybe how movements have learned about the economics of climate change and climate action. Like, what is it about the Sunrise movement, for example, strategically, that shows the ability to kind of influence positive or progressive policy change from your perspective?
I think it's really interesting here because I think that movements have led economics rather than economics leading movements here. Often I think, we have this idea, and as an economist, I would love to believe this in some ways, that, my wonderful white papers that I publish are what go out there and convince people that we need an investment-led approach to decarbonization. But in reality, it's a little bit of the other way around. And what we're seeing is that people realize that the politics of simple a carbon pricing approach to addressing the climate crisis just wasn't going to work. Which I do want to note, I am an advocate of carbon pricing if done well. I think it is a important part of the climate policy toolkit, again, with a huge caveat, if done well. And we can get more into that if you're interested later. But, I think people saw that, okay, the US has chronic unemployment, chronic underinvestment. You're not going to carbon price your way into generating an electric vehicle industry. You're not going to carbon price your way into generating high quality carbon free public transportation or decarbonizing public schools. These things necessitate public investment. And so uh, I think a lot of the change in economics came out of the failure of neoliberalism to do two things. One is to actually, meaningfully address the climate crisis, whether that be, simply through carbon pricing in action, or just the failure of being able to adopt carbon pricing due to people's, opposition to taxes. But also, I think it came out of people's, broader frustration with how the economy was running, particularly following the 2008 financial crisis, and seeing that, quote unquote, free market capitalism was an utter failure, and that, to both provide, jobs for people and also to provide good jobs, and to provide investments that will bring widespread social benefits, we need government to play a larger role in the market. And I think these are the things that led people to, really work towards that vision of the Green New Deal, or that vision that became the Inflation Reduction Act, where we have a much more holistic approach from government, both engaging with civil society, but most importantly, heavily investing across sectors of the economy to work towards a new green economy of the 21st century.
Hmm. Yeah, I think, my hope is that, as you rightly said, like, we have the technologies, we have, massive kind of documents and analyses of the type that you've helped produce, that give us like a roadmap, so to speak. What we require, it feels like, is a kind of revolution in our political culture to some extent. And my hope is that that is like happening. But I think like not a missing piece, but an important piece is this sort of policy or financial literacy element of climate action. And so, this is something I wanted to kind of really dig into lately, in part because, I live in Nova Scotia, where carbon pricing has just sort of come online and it is divisive. It's affecting elections. Um, and so, like, I want to get to the bottom of it, like, discursively. What is the discourse that determines where people land in relationship to the economics of climate action? Like, what are the tools that policymakers use to imagine a way out of just the infrastructure of incineration that we've produced through fossil capital? And I like this, line in one of your reports where you say that you and your co-authors believe that decarbonization can be done in an equitable, rapid, and in fact pro-growth way if we deploy a three-pillar approach, one that uses the entire range of policy tools available to us. One, large-scale public investments. Two, comprehensive regulations to ensure decarbonization across the board. And three, a cap and dividend system that puts a price on carbon while offsetting the regressive effects on income distribution, because it hits low-income people quite hard if not done right. So, that's like, there's a lot in that sentence, of course. But it gives us a lot to build from, I think, from a policy perspective. And, I'm interested in hearing you unpack that, but specifically sort of in relationship to the kind of reductive, in some ways, debate that has developed over the last several years around like green growth versus degrowth. Because, you're saying it's kind of both, and that like you can actually decarbonize in a pro-growth way, suggests almost like a form of degrowth that happens without overthrowing capitalism, from my perspective. So I guess to frame it in a form of a question or two questions, is de-emphasizing growth so socially and politically naive? Is it impossible to shrink the economy without creating hardship, unrest, disenchantment, and so on?
You know, I In general, I tend to sidestep this question. And the reason is because I don't think it's the right or the most important question for us to focus on, particularly when we consider, low and middle income countries, and particularly when we consider that here in the United States, we still have 40 million people living in poverty, and another 100 million people, living one small hiccup, whether that be an illness or a job loss away from poverty. And so, given the degree of economic deprivation, both here in the US and globally, I think that it's imperative that we continue to focus on how we improve the human condition. Now, that said, do I think that growth maps perfectly onto improving human condition? No, absolutely not. And, but if you ask me, do we need more good growth? Do we need to continue focusing on improving healthcare and education and housing? Absolutely, we need that. But is it also true that we might need to, shrink and most importantly, eliminate some sectors of the economy, like the fossil fuel sector? Absolutely. So I think, what we need to focus on is what I think of as good growth. Um, growth that actually provides, quality lives for, all people. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm not willing to abandon growth, but I'm also not willing to follow growth blindly. It's just a more nuanced conversation of growth versus degrowth. I think that just leads us to a lot of false truths and to a lot of black and white pictures that just do not properly represent the complex world in which we all inhabit. So for me, this is about how do we grow the green economy? How do we ensure those are high quality union jobs? How do we ensure that all people have access to, clean energy and clean air? I mean, just thinking about clean air for a moment, 250,000 Americans die every year from pollution associated with combusting fossil fuels. More than 8 million people globally die from the pollution from combusting fossil fuels. Let's talk about how we improve not only, both human well-being, which is most importantly just by providing people with life, but also, economic productivity. It's making sure people live and that they're healthy. And so there are just so many areas I think we will gain from when we transition, as we continue to transition away from fossil fuels. And for me, the most pressing questions are how do we do it better, more equitably, and faster?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. Like I just, this is what I'm getting out of your work is that it is working like within the terms that are used, but it's providing like a way out of being kind of mired in those terms. Like you're not unconcerned with questions of ethics, human flourishing, thriving, like, and that to me is kind of what's refreshing to some extent about reading work that focuses on the economics of climate action. It doesn't throw those things aside. It says that those are kind of at the core, in many ways, of the push for decarbonization. And like to kind of build a little bit from that, you talk about like the destruction of physical assets is a crucial part of the struggle. And I'm curious like about the, because we have not historically thought of like clean air as a physical asset, right? That's just this negative externality or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And so, using the language of physical assets it seems to me, a kind of rhetorical or political calculation on some level that is about justifying policy measures that are about like protecting nature. I had a conversation a little while ago with someone from this insurance company, Intact, where she talked about how this long history of regarding nature as priceless has reduced it to being worthless, and it's about a kind of stressing of that worth that nature fundamentally has, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, I wondered if you wanted to kind of speak to that either from a personal or political level. And that idea of like giving the planet the best chance possible. To me, it's like about, giving the planet agency in this struggle as well, like recognizing that the planet, these natural assets, like they do things for us.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, first, I just, I do want to highlight that, I think traditional economics has really led us astray by focusing, by the lack of engagement with, focusing on basic humanity and ensuring people have what they need to live, flourishing lives. What's promised in our Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I mean, that's what everybody wants.
Mm-hmm.
And, instead we've built a system that is exclusively focused on the profit motive. And has that, substantially improved our capabilities to produce more stuff? You bet. But I think we are at a juncture where, it's really important for us to think much more carefully about what we're producing, how we're producing, why we're producing, and really how to reorganize our economy and society to focus on human beings rather than to focus on the profit motive.
Oh yeah, I mean, like, and this is in part why I think it's just politically smart to focus on the generating of jobs. Like that is a thing that we have to look at the data, care about first and foremost, like above climate action. They're deeply, deeply concerned about how slow governments are moving on climate policy, but like they're primarily concerned about cost of living. And why wouldn't they be, right? So if we can, combine the two things, then you get to a place where, you're kind of talking about things that people support in massive numbers. Like this speaks to the kind of history you provide of, yeah, like public policy giving us a means out of particular crises. And I guess I wanted to ask about that, like how you write about the ways in which we can respond to crises. So you used the precedent at one point, for example, of nationalizing industries during, the world wars, especially maybe World War II. You talk about like bans that have, led to a kind of safeguarding of human life, whether it's like a ban on CFCs or a ban on like tobacco, etc. Like a lot of this nonetheless feels about like it's about defamiliarizing or shaking up our socialized relationship to convenience and a certain organization of space in especially the global north. And this revolution is going to come by sort of rehabituating or dehabituating that, I think, those attachments. And yet we're largely focused on kind of maintaining the structure as it is and just changing the energy inputs, it feels like.
Yeah.
That is to kind of ask the question of whether or to what extent phasing out fossil fuels is in some ways fundamentally different from responding to a war, like an immediate threat, or different in some ways from like banning tobacco, a thing that you don't necessarily need, right? Like the fossil fuel economy is this thing that a lot of people can't think their way around. So how do you kind of try and provide a vision of a life without those things that also like lowers energy usage, energy needs? It's difficult to not frame that in terms of sacrifice. And so I wondered if you could kind of, speak to certain precedents, regulations that have largely improved, quality of life, and whether there are some like gaps in terms of the analogy to past struggles.
This is such a, important question here that you're raising, and one that, where I think that, the degrowth advocates actually are helpful to agree in terms of, they interject in this conversation that we do need to seriously rethink how we organize, society and to what ends. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think that necessitates reducing growth and most importantly, reducing human well-being, but I do think it necessitates us really rethinking and being far more intentional about how and why, we structure our economy and our lives. So just to give
Mm-hmm.
you an example though, I disagree a little bit with the sacrifice framing. I
Mm-hmm.
think we can and should do things better. That doesn't necessitate a whole ton of sacrifice, but does necessitate us making change.
Mm-hmm.
So, right now, for example, in the United States, you have a lot of people that want to live in what are called 15-minute cities, fairly urban areas that, where you can walk to most of your amenities. The idea, they call it a 15-minute city because you can walk to, most of your basic necessities, public transit, a grocery store, a pharmacy, a coffee shop, importantly, your neighborhood bar, let's be real, within 15 minutes.
Right. It sounds lovely to me. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And, I
Hmm.
am privileged to live in central New Jersey where I have everything minus a grocery store within 15 minutes of me. And the quality of life is tremendous. Now, does that mean I do not have, it does mean that I don't have a 2,500 square foot, McMansion. But we live in a
Hmm.
lovely townhome that has plenty of space for us. And, we are able to be a one car household, which saves us a ton of money and a ton of headache because we can walk and bike everywhere. And, we just need our car to go to the grocery store and to go on weekend excursions. And that doesn't feel like a sacrifice. To me, this feels like a high quality of life. And so, and this is why we need government-led planning and investments to make things like that feasible. So for an example, yes, we can provide EV tax credits like the Inflation Reduction Act does, but what we really need to do is a massive build out of carbon-free, fare-free public transportation so that, people are more connected and that people can get around on high quality public transit and enjoy themselves reading a book or listening to a podcast rather than
Hmm.
driving all the time. Driving is not enjoyable. We do it because we have to.
Yeah.
And so I think that again, to me, doesn't scream sacrifice. That to me screams, reorganization of our lived experience and thinking more intentionally about
Hmm.
how and why we, you know, organize our day-to-day lives.
Yeah. And honestly, I think it leads to a kind of renewed appreciation for community. You're kind of just trying to survive when you're driving. There is a level
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
competitiveness to it. Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there in terms of kind of communicating the benefits of trying to divorce yourself from especially this kind of single occupancy, isolated and individualist experience of driving a car. Um, a lot of potential there, and I think a lot of potential too in you know meeting people where they are when they can't divorce themselves from the car, right? Like you talk about how a transition to EVs is vital, but that the most cost effective way to decarbonize transportation is, of course, as you say, moving to mass transit, making it like free and electrified, ideally, cycling, walking, active transportation. But the key thing is like, there is, and I'm seeing this locally, it's like hard to pitch the business case for EV fast charging infrastructure. Like you do need public institutions in order to put that in place to address the anxiety that people have, sometimes called range anxiety, around like EV adoption. Like where are we at in terms of the push for electric vehicles, and where do you see governments demanding this sort of policy shift toward facilitating like public charging infrastructure, et cetera?
Yeah, I think we are at a really exciting juncture right now. Electric vehicles are taking off quite rapidly here in the United States. The growth has just been absolutely tremendous. And actually, when you look at the data, what we see is that in terms of sales, internal combustion engine vehicles, traditional gas cars, have already peaked. All new sale growth is in electric vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, really exciting. And it's precisely why you see when you watch, the Super Bowl or something, it's precisely why you see everybody falling over themselves to share their EV commercial, every car company,
Mm-hmm.
because they're fighting for this new market share and they realize that the future is electric vehicles. Even the future of trucks is electric vehicles. I mean, when you talk to, construction workers, I mean, what Ford has done with the Ford Lightning or what Rivian has done is quite outstanding in terms of providing a really high quality, work truck
Mm-hmm.
that just provides, workers that actually need trucks. I'm not talking about truck hobbyists with, the functionality that they really need, particularly on, construction jobs and more remote work areas. Now,
Mm-hmm.
the government, rightly in the Inflation Reduction Act, is investing quite heavily in build out of the charging infrastructure. And they also, recently made a deal with Tesla to open up Tesla's electric vehicle charging network to non-Tesla owners, which I think is, exciting. Would I prefer to have seen something different? Maybe, perhaps the nationalization of Tesla's EV charging network? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think that infrastructure should be more public infrastructure in order to bring benefits, to the public rather than, again, solely rely on the profit motive. Nevertheless, I think it's really the area of decarbonization that we're, poised to do the best in over the next decade. People are realizing electric cars are reliable, are actually, particularly when you think about the 5-year cost of ownership cost, and are fun. They really are. So I'm really encouraged by the transition we're seeing underway with electric vehicles.
Yeah, I mean, me too. There's like a part of me that sort of is suspicious of the kind of the need to market like electric SUVs and trucks to people that maybe want them not necessarily for utility reasons, but for like status reasons. Like the history of the SUV is obviously very fraught. There was an effort by, I guess, the auto industry to market larger vehicles by sort of making the SUV feel sexy by associating it basically with a kind of militaristic masculinity and these kinds of things. Like it's fraught, I think, from a cultural perspective. But if we did shift toward, especially relatively small EVs, it would mean at least a sort of armistice in our extractivist war on nature that has been really driven by fossil fuels. And so I think there's like a little bit of a gap between the renewable, the renewable push that we're seeing, which is so kind of market-based, and the kind of the renewable push that we need, which is that shift based on kind of like science and making sure that we're attacking the social license of fossil fuels, What would it mean in the current moment from your perspective to use your term, tame the corporate power of fossil fuels, to rein in corporate power in that specific sector? What actually needs to happen to move away fundamentally from this incredibly destructive industry? What are the levers, as we sometimes like to say, that we can pull in order to actually like break the power of the fossil fuel industry culturally and politically?
I think this is a fantastic question for us to wrap up our conversation on here today, because as an economist, what I can say is, at the end of the day, addressing our climate change problem that we're in the midst of here today is not one of solving the economics. It's not one of solving the technology. We've largely done those things. It's one of solving the political power problem, where the fossil fuel industry and those who benefit directly from it have far too much sway over Congress, and in turn that is precisely what has prevented climate action. Climate action is not too expensive. We know it would bring tremendous economic benefits. What is too expensive is continuing on the status quo. It's not that we don't have the technology. We have the technology in place to decarbonize 90% of the economy. In the last 10%, I am fully confident we will have the technology to do so as we speed our way towards decarbonization in the coming years. It is purely, at this point, a political problem where we need to sever the political power of the fossil fuel industry. And I wrote a paper on this with some colleagues where we looked at the idea of nationalizing the fossil fuel industry as a way to eliminate the power of fossil capital once and for all in our political system. And I firmly believe that that is a legal, a viable, and a powerful path forward for us to take collective ownership over the fossil fuel industry, engage in a managed wind down of that industry where we prioritize the well-being of fossil fuel workers and environmental justice communities, and do so in a controlled way, so we're not throwing fossil fuel workers and fossil fuel communities at the bottom of the coal ash pile again, as we have historically. So I think that is the way forward, but there is not going to be a true transition until we reckon with the power of the fossil fuel industry.
And this is why you say just flatly the time has come for the U.S. government to nationalize the fossil fuel industry. And I really appreciate the analysis, the kind of systems level analysis that your work provides. So yeah, thanks so much for talking to me. This has been a workout, but in a good way. And I appreciate you giving me your time today.
It's been a pleasure. You have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much.